On the afternoon of April 17th, 2003, 33-year-old John Parker Jr. sat at his desk in his office at J&J Parker Industries in Maryville, Indiana. He was looking over some paperwork and hoping he would get at least a few minutes without any interruptions to finish reading it. Because in John's world, a few minutes were hard to find. John was the owner of J&J, which was a consulting company dedicated to training people to sell high-end vacuums. Now, vacuums were not glamorous, but his company was really successful, and running it was a lot of work. He was on his feet all day, managing about 25 employees and solving constant problems, and he usually did not get much quiet time to do things like paperwork. And even though John did complain about this, the truth was he actually loved being busy. He had always been a very hard worker. He'd started in the vacuum business as a door-to-door salesman, and even though everyone told him there was no money in vacuums, he'd proved them wrong. He was so good at sales that he made his first $1 million by the time he was just 30 years old. And now he had a whole company that taught other people how to be great at it too. But now, as John tried to get through the paperwork, his desk phone rang. He sighed and he picked it up, and it was his wife, Judy. She told him that their daughter had left her homework in his office when she was there just the other day, and she asked him if he could bring it home with him. Now, John was about to tell his wife that this was now the second time she had reminded him about this homework, but he stopped himself because right now things were pretty good. Things between them were solid, and so he tried to remind himself that it was not worth messing that up. So John and Judy had been married for 10 years, and she was his partner in life and in business. They had raised 4 kids together, and Judy was actually the second J in J&J Parker Industries. John knew that to everyone else they looked like a happy, successful power couple, but the truth was much more complicated, because about a year ago, Judy had an affair. And this had devastated John at the time, but he really wanted to give their marriage another shot. They'd been living in Michigan at the time, and they agreed that moving the business to Maryville, Indiana, where John was from, would be a good way to start fresh. And so far, they both felt like it had been the right call. The business was doing really well, things were looking up, and most importantly, John and Judy were actually getting along. So now, instead of getting annoyed at his wife for repeatedly asking him about the homework, he just said, sure, and that he would see her later for their date night. As soon as John hung up with Judy, he heard a knock on the door, and his office manager, Barry Jones, charged in holding more files. Barry dropped them on John's desk and said sorry, but he needed a signature. It was for the final termination paperwork for an employee John fired, whose name was Derek Hall. So a week earlier, John had made the very difficult decision to let Derek go. It wasn't personal. Derek just wasn't a good fit. He couldn't keep up with the sales quota. And John had really high standards for his employees. That's how he became a millionaire in the first place. But Derek somehow thought his firing was John's fault. And he'd actually showed up at J&J and made a scene in the parking lot saying that John had shorted him hundreds of dollars on his last paycheck. And when John tried to defuse things, Derek had physically attacked him. The police had to be called, and they separated John and Derek before it got too ugly. And John had ended up paying Derek what he wanted, since he just wanted the whole thing to be over, which was also why now he was immediately scribbling his signature on the termination paperwork and handing it back to Barry, because hopefully now he would just never have to see or speak to Derek ever again. After work, around 6 p.m., John drove home, which was about 15 minutes away from the office. And when he got inside his house, he heard Judy call down from upstairs that she'd be ready soon. So he yelled back that there was no rush, and he meant it. And this was because just over an hour earlier, his older brother David had met him at the office, and they'd gone to a buffet together. So John really wasn't hungry at all anymore. But dinner with Judy was definitely more about spending time together than actually eating, so he wasn't going to say anything about the late lunch. John made his way into the living room where his 4 kids were watching TV. It was his 17-year-old daughter, Christina, her 15-year-old brother, Daniel, and their 2 younger sisters. The older kids were going to babysit the younger ones tonight so that he and Judy could go out. But when John tried to make conversation with them, Christina and Daniel gave him the cold shoulder. Now, to any other parent, this could be interpreted perhaps as just typical teenage behavior. But to John, it was more loaded than that. So Christina and Daniel were actually his stepkids. John had been in their life since they were really little, and he considered himself to be their dad. And John had always tried to be very involved in things like coaching Daniel in baseball and going to school concerts and parent-teacher conferences. But his relationship with these kids had changed lately. And frankly, both of the kids had really begun acting out. Christina repeatedly threw parties at their house whenever he and Judy were gone, while Daniel was combative and hung out with a group of friends who were seemingly always in trouble with the law. And this had created a lot of conflict between them and John, because he was the one who tried to discipline them, while Judy sort of always played the good cop. But John knew better than to try and force them to talk to him. So when he went in there, he just kept quiet and they all watched the TV until Judy came downstairs and said she was ready to go. Hours later, just before 10 p.m., John and Judy left their dinner, got in the car, and drove back to John's office at J&J Parker Industries, which was in an office park in a secluded area. And the two of them had had a really nice dinner. However, during their meal, Christina had called and wanted to know where that homework was that John was supposed to bring home. And John, very embarrassingly, suddenly realized that despite all those reminders from Judy that he was getting so annoyed by, he had forgotten the homework at the office. So that's why they were here now, to pick up the homework on their way home. John parked the car in the lot and both of them hopped out. When they got inside the building, they found that the office manager, Barry, was still there working, which John expected. I mean, things had been busy lately with planning seminars and finding a new hire to replace Derek, and Barry was in charge of keeping it all organized. And John really didn't feel too bad that Barry was putting in so many hours. I mean, this was his job, and the company relied on him to ensure nothing major slipped through the cracks. So when Barry mentioned to John when he went inside that, he actually might be heading home soon, John said no. At the same time, John saw his wife grab the homework from his desk and then hustle out to the car, and as she disappeared, John told Barry that he was sorry, but Barry needed to stay and finish what he was doing. But then, to make up for delivering this bad news, John offered Barry his leftovers from dinner. He had basically a full meal since he had not been hungry. Barry sort of grumbled about it, but said he would take the food if he was offering, and so John nodded and went outside to grab it. Moments later, John arrived at the car, where Judy was waiting in the passenger seat. He opened up the back door, and he picked up the styrofoam to-go box. When Judy looked back at him, he told her he was going back to give the food to Barry, and she just shrugged and said, fine, then turned back around. But right at that same moment, John heard the sound of footsteps in the concrete right behind him. But before he could turn around, he heard a deafening bang. Judy heard the bang too, which was followed quickly by a second one, and she instinctively ducked down in her seat and then looked back at John just in time to see him fall hard to the ground. And before she could do or say anything, she saw a masked person in dark clothes crouch over John for just a few seconds, and then they sprinted away from the car towards the main road. Judy leapt out of the car and ran to John, yelling his name, but he just lay there on the pavement, not moving. And then she saw this huge pool of blood forming right underneath his head. With her heart racing, Judy ran to the office door and screamed at Barry to call the police. By about 10:30 that night, the parking lot at J&J Parker Industries was overrun with officers and crime scene technicians. Among them was Detective Donald Toth, who had been with the Maryville Police Department for the last 21 years. When he first got the call, dispatch had only known that there was a shooting. But when he arrived on the scene, a first responder told him that there'd actually been a fatality. 33-year-old John Parker Jr., who had been identified by two witnesses at the scene. The first responder also explained that when they got there, before they spoke to the witnesses, they had looked for John's wallet to identify him, but the wallet had not been in his pockets or in the car. And when Toth heard that, his first thought was that maybe this was a robbery. But as soon as he walked over and got a look at John, he immediately revised that theory. John was on his back behind a parked car, and the first thing Toth noticed was that he had a lot of nice jewelry on. Gold and diamond rings, a bracelet, and an expensive-looking Rolex watch. Also, this office park was not close to anything, and it just didn't feel like the kind of place a random mugger would go looking for victims. Toth wondered if the killer took the wallet just to make police believe this could be a robbery. Because the longer he looked at John's body, the more signs he saw that this was likely an efficient, planned execution. John didn't have any visible defensive wounds, and when Toth used a gloved hand to move John's head to the side, he saw a gunshot wound right behind his ear. Toth had actually been a paramedic before becoming a detective, so he knew that shot had likely killed John instantly. It also meant John had his back turned to the shooter when he died. There was an open styrofoam to-go container of food and some car keys on the ground right next to John's body, and their placement made it feel like John might have been holding them when he fell. If John had an altercation, like with a thief or somebody who killed him in the heat of the moment, the scene would be way messier. As far as Toth could tell, the killer had just walked up to John while he was busy with something at his car, aimed the gun, pulled the trigger, and then after he died, grabbed John's wallet and then left. Which also meant the killer very likely had not been at the scene long enough to leave behind much evidence. All Toth saw were just 2 shell casings, and he doubted there would be footprints or DNA. And when Toth spoke to some of the other officers at the scene, he learned they'd already done a sweep of the office park, and they'd looked in dumpsters and bushes and on the roofs of all the buildings, but they hadn't found anything, and they didn't see any cameras or surveillance in the area. So, as Toth stood in the middle of the parking lot and watched his officers continue to search the scene, he realized he was the lead on a case with virtually no forensic evidence, which might have been daunting, but he did have at least 2 witnesses. About an hour later, Toth sat down across a table from John Parker's wife, Judy, inside of an interrogation room inside the Maryville police station. He'd learned a few things about Judy already. She'd been the one who told Barry to call the police, and she was with John when he was shot. He also knew that, as the spouse of the murder victim, she was his best suspect. Now, Toth didn't really think Judy was the actual shooter, but considering how pristine the crime scene was, he knew it was possible this was a hit, done by a professional, and Judy maybe could have hired them. But as Toth spoke to Judy, he started to waver on that theory. She couldn't stop crying, which made it hard for her to get her words out, and when she did speak, it was slow, like it was taking her a lot of effort to say anything at all. She did manage to give Toth a timeline, how she and John had gone out to dinner for their date, and then stopped over at the office after, since one of their daughters had left some homework there. She said the office manager, Barry, had been there, and that when she had gone back to the car, she knew that Barry and John were speaking. And then at some point, John, he left the building and came out to get his dinner leftovers, and at that time, she had turned away from him, and then she heard these 2 loud shots. And then when she turned back around, she saw John fall, and then also there was this figure in dark clothes who was sort of bending down on top of John, and then they ran away. However, when Judy finished telling her story about what had happened that night, all the events that led up to the shooting, something changed in her demeanor. The shakiness in her voice and all the grief that was sort of pouring out of her to this point, it vanished. And in its place, Judy became very hardened, and she looked right at Toth, and she said, "You better find the person who did this and bring them to justice." And when Toth saw this, he almost got goosebumps from it because it was such a quick departure from what had been going on. And he thought to himself, either she is a great actress and this is all a big facade and she did it or she was involved, or this is genuine. She's a grieving widow who doesn't know what to make of the fact that her husband has just been killed. At some point, Toth asked Judy if she could think of anybody who might have wanted to hurt John. And Judy appeared to think for a second, but eventually she just said no. She said that John was an incredible husband and father, and they had a great marriage that they had really worked hard on, and everybody at work respected him. But then something clearly occurred to Judy, because she frowned and said, actually, there was someone from work who didn't like John. His name was Derek, and John had fired him recently. And after the firing, Derek had come back to J&J and started a physical fight with John in the parking lot. When Toth heard that, he perked up. A disgruntled employee was definitely somebody that he should be speaking to. And Toth was speaking to the office manager, Barry Jones, right after this, and so he figured he could ask him about that incident too. Now, Toth wasn't ready to rule Judy out as a suspect, since he still needed to check her finances and talk to her friends and family about her marriage. But for now, he didn't see a reason to hold her. So he told Judy that for now, she was welcome to go home and be with her kids and, grieve, and they would be in touch. Then Toth got up and he left to go to another interrogation room where Barry was waiting. The following morning, Toth walked up a flight of porch steps. He was at the home of Derek Hall, the ex-employee of J&J Parker Industries that John Parker had recently fired. Last night, Toth had spoken to John's office manager, Barry Jones, who had confirmed what John's wife Judy had said about Derek, that after he was fired, there had been this huge, ugly fight at the office between Derek and John, and Derek was the instigator. It was the only useful information Barry had given him, since he said, during the shooting, he had actually been in the bathroom, and so he hadn't heard or seen anything until he heard Judy screaming for him. But the lead on Derek was enough. And the other thing was, Barry and Judy were not the only ones who thought Derek might have killed John. Just before this, Toth also spoke to John's brother, David, who was incredibly devastated and furious about his brother's death, and David had also pointed the finger at Derek. So Toth was very eager to meet Derek, a man 3 people claimed could be a killer. Toth got to the top of the steps and knocked on the front door. And when Derek answered, Toth introduced himself and explained why he was there. Derek seemed stunned, but he immediately let Toth inside. Moments later, Toth was sitting across from Derek in the living room, and even though Derek seemed very uncomfortable and nervous, he told Toth he was actually glad the detective was there, because he really wanted to give his side of the story. Derek said that when he started working at J&J, he was given way more work than he'd expected, and when he couldn't keep up with it, he was fired. And then, John shorted him $400 on his final paycheck, so he had gone to J&J to get the money he was owed. Now, he admitted that it did lead to a physical fight, but he said they'd only pushed each other, and it ended up getting resolved, like it wasn't that big of a deal. But beyond that, Derek insisted he could not have killed John because he'd actually spent the whole evening last night at a friend's house playing video games. He gave Toth the friend's number and said, "Go ahead, call him, he'll confirm it." Toth tried not to look too disappointed as he took down this number, but if the alibi checked out, he could rule Derek out as a suspect. Now, it was possible that Derek had, actually taken a hit out on John, but to Toth, that seemed unlikely. If Derek was that upset over $400, it didn't seem likely that he would have the excess cash to pay anybody to go commit a murder. But as Toth left Derek's house and got back in his car, he decided the interview was not a total bust after all. Because talking to Derek made him realize he needed to focus more on John's business life. According to John's brother David, John got rich young and built his company very quickly. And in Toth's experience, those kinds of people often stepped on others to get to the top. The next day, Toth walked down a hallway at the precinct towards an interrogation room. He had confirmed Derek's alibi with his friend, so he had to move on to other suspects for now. Which was fine with Toth because he was about to sit down with his new prime suspect, who happened to be one of his former witnesses. It was John's office manager, Barry Jones. Yesterday, Toth had gone to the J&J Parker Industries office and made it a point to speak to every single employee about John. And he found out that John was a great boss who pushed his employees, but he worked hard himself. The employees also said that Judy was an essential part of the company, and the Parkers as a duo were well respected in the world of vacuum sales. But office gossip also said their marriage was not exactly happy, and it was sort of common knowledge that Judy was having an affair with Barry Jones. A few employees had even caught them having sex at the office. Now, neither Barry nor Judy had mentioned this the first time Toth had spoken to them, so now Toth had no idea if anything they had said to him was true. Barry could have been lying about being in the bathroom and was actually, the shooter. Or he and Judy were maybe working together and they were both lying. Toth was leaning towards the second option because he had also found out that Judy was going to get a big payday from the death of her husband. She was the beneficiary of a $1 million life insurance policy. And aside from that, John's general estate was worth around $2 million. Maybe, he thought, she and Barry wanted to take John's money and run off together. So when Toth went into the interrogation room, he intended on essentially saying that the investigation was over. They'd caught Barry in a lie, and they knew what he did. But when Toth sat down and confronted him, Barry did not act like somebody who was guilty and cornered. He was charismatic and confident, and he said the affair was total office gossip. He was just good friends with Judy, and they worked together closely. Barry said he and Judy and John were like family. In fact, he said he was living with one of Judy's cousins from Texas. Now, Toth didn't really believe what Barry was saying, but even though he kept pressing him, Barry stuck to his story. And eventually, Toth just had to let him go. because without any evidence, it was just Barry and Judy's word against the employees. And even if they were having an affair, that was not enough to prove they also conspired to murder John. On Monday, April 21st, so 4 days after John's murder, Toth was at his desk, rereading the notes from Barry and Judy's interviews for what felt like the millionth time. He was still trying to find a concrete way to link Judy and Barry to John's murder before approaching Judy about it. But so far, other than the office rumors, he hadn't found anything, and he didn't really have any other leads, aside from learning that the shell casings found on the scene were from a .25 caliber gun. Which was useful to know, but it wasn't going to help him with his suspect list. Toth leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He'd been full speed ahead on this case since Thursday night, and he was exhausted. He was starting to consider maybe going home and getting some rest when he heard a light knock on his door. An officer poked his head in and told Toth there was somebody on line 3 with a tip, and it sounded like a good one. Toth picked up his phone, and the person on the other end of the line explained they were a police officer as well from a nearby town, and they said that they had heard about John Parker's murder on the news and realized they had some information. So about 6 months earlier, this officer had been called to a local juvenile detention facility to take a report. The staff there had done a random search on their kids and found that 2 of them had a lot of cash, over $200. Having cash was against the rules, and when the kids were asked where they got it, they said it was payment for a hit on John Parker. Now, that stunned Toth, but not nearly as much as what the officer said next. These 2 kids said the person who had arranged this hit was a former high school classmate of theirs named Daniel Hicks. And Toth couldn't believe what he was hearing, because Daniel Hicks was John's own 15-year-old stepson. Toth had really begun to think that this murder could be a professional hit. But it did not occur to him that this hit could be linked to family and also a child. Now, the officer on the phone explained that they really hadn't taken this very seriously at the time, so no one had notified John's family or spoken to Daniel about it. Which, Toth did not have to point out here, but this was a huge screw-up. But he wasn't focused on, the right and wrong of it. He was just focused on figuring out what happened. And so Toth got the names of these 2 kids with the cash from the officer, and when he hung up, he immediately sent some of his own officers to track these kids down. Then Toth put in a call to Judy. He needed to bring her son, Daniel, in for an interview, and since he was a minor, Judy was going to have to come too. Late that same night, actually after midnight, Toth was once again inside of an interrogation room with Judy. But this time, instead of answering questions herself, Judy was sitting at the back of the room, watching while her son Daniel sat at the table with Toth and a few other detectives. Toth had spoken to Judy right before this, and she had seemed genuinely shocked to hear that her child apparently asked somebody to kill John. She told Toth there had to be a mistake here, and she was happy for police to speak to Daniel directly because that would allow them to clear this all up. Toth had decided not to ask Judy about the affair with Barry at that moment because she was being very cooperative, letting them speak to her son, and he also just didn't want to upset her and have her change her mind. They also had not been able to find those 2 kids that Daniel supposedly hired, and so right now, Daniel was the only one he could speak to. And so now, watching Daniel, Toth could see he was acting like a typical young person who was in trouble. He seemed nervous, and he was blinking a lot, and he kept rearranging his hands like he wasn't really sure what to do with them. And so Toth decided his best approach was just to be direct. Maybe he could scare the truth out of Daniel. So right off the bat, he told Daniel he knew about the murder for hire, and he told him to explain himself. And to Toth's surprise, Daniel took a big breath and then said it was true. He had actually paid 2 friends some money he had saved from his allowance because he hated his stepdad. John was always on his case and yelling at him, and Daniel just wanted it to stop. But Daniel said he didn't want John to die. He was adamant that he had just asked his friends to, teach John a lesson and beat him up. Toth thought about this. It was possible that Daniel was telling the truth here, and the 2 kids in the detention center either lied or had decided on their own to kill John. But that felt a little far-fetched, because why would these kids lie to get themselves in more trouble? Toth thought it was much more likely that Daniel was the one who was lying, and Toth was not about to let Daniel go anywhere until he found out for sure. So he told Daniel and Judy that he was sorry, but they were going to have to take Daniel into custody. Then Toth called some officers in to make the arrest, and as he left the room, you could hear Judy and Daniel sounding completely shocked behind him. Now, at this point, even though Toth had been up all night and he was totally exhausted, at the same time, he actually felt far more alert than he did even in the couple days before, because now it felt like they really were, making movement on this case. And so instead of trying to get some rest back at his house, he went back to his office, poured some coffee, and kept on working. 2003, so almost a month after John Parker's murder, Detective Don Toth sat at his desk reading some copy for a flyer and making some last-minute changes to it. So far, it said that police were looking for information about John Parker's murder in Maryville, and it offered a reward to anybody who came forward. Toth planned to pass these flyers out all over town tomorrow to see if the public could maybe give him a new lead. It was sort of an act of desperation, because while this case had seemed close a couple times to being wrapped up, just a few weeks ago, now it was pretty much dead. It had taken police a while, but they had finally found both of those kids from the detention center that Daniel apparently hired to, rough up his dad, who ultimately apparently killed him. And the kids admitted to meeting with Daniel and accepting the money. But it turned out there was just no way they were actually the murderers. One of them had been thousands of miles away in Las Vegas when John was killed, and the other had been in detention at a juvenile facility. And so since Toth could not prove the assassins Daniel hired had actually killed anyone, he'd had to let Daniel go. But that didn't mean Daniel was innocent here. Those two kids had said that Daniel did ask for John to be killed, not just beat up. So Daniel was lying about that. And Toth didn't think someone who wanted to kill his father had just stopped wanting to kill his dad all of a sudden. But since Toth knew Daniel was at home babysitting his younger siblings during the time of John's murder, Toth figured he'd likely gotten somebody else to do it. But Toth couldn't just keep talking to Daniel, because Judy had gotten a lawyer, and they were now not letting Toth question the family members at all anymore, which was very frustrating, since Toth wasn't done with Judy either. Out of everyone, she benefited the most from John's death because she was a beneficiary on his life insurance. And she was very likely having an affair with his office manager, Barry, and so maybe part of her motive could have been just to hide the affair from him. And then also Barry. He's potentially having this affair with Judy, John's wife. He might have a motive as well to get rid of John, to just keep this thing a secret. Also, he definitely seemed to think that John was, a pretty tough boss, and so maybe he just had had enough, and he was complicit or actively involved in getting rid of John. He was also at the scene of the crime right when it happened, and since there weren't any cameras, Toth couldn't actually confirm Barry's version of events. But at this point, Toth didn't have the evidence he needed to prove any of these suspects actually killed John or hired somebody to do it. And he also didn't have enough evidence to eliminate them and narrow down his pool further. Instead, Toth had just kept adding to it. Because as of this week, he was also considering John's brother, David, as a person of interest. A few days ago, some officers had been called to Judy's house because John's brother David had stopped by her house and gotten into a verbal fight with the family. And this was not the first time this had happened. Apparently, David had gone over there and threatened the family before. One time, he had even damaged their car. This kind of behavior could mean David was just lashing out because he was grieving, but it also could mean he was erratic and potentially violent. Plus, he had been with John on the afternoon of the murder at that buffet, and he knew that John was going to have dinner with his wife later, so he could have guessed that John would check in at the office after they were done eating, since he was a famously hard worker. Toth sighed and took a break from looking at this flyer. His brain was fried, but he felt hopeful these flyers would give him the tip he desperately needed to break this case. And so the next day, Toth and some other officers passed these flyers out. But then weeks went by with no tips. And even though Toth did eventually get a few responses to the flyers, none of them gave him any actual evidence. So over the next few months, Toth spent his days in his office, poring over files for something he missed, or maybe a witness they didn't interview, or evidence they'd maybe overlooked. But there was just nothing. And as the months turned into years, Toth had to turn to other projects. And eventually, the John Parker murder case went cold. 4 years after John's murder, on an afternoon in February of 2007, Toth arrived at work for the day and headed to his office. Now, he had not forgotten about the John Parker case, but he was not actively investigating it at this point. In fact, all his cases had been winding down because he was planning to retire in just a few months. But right before he actually got to his office door, a narcotics officer caught up to him and asked for a word. The officer explained that he knew Toth wasn't on their narcotics team, but they had a warrant out for a man involved in one of their drug investigations, and they had realized this man had some crossover with one of Toth's homicides from 2003, the John Parker case. Toth stopped in his tracks and immediately told this officer to go get him an interview. And sure enough, later that day, Toth sat down with this man who was very chatty and seemed extremely eager to talk. And the first thing this man did was explain that the person he lived with knew John Parker, and they had admitted to him that they were directly involved in his death. And when this man told Toth the name of this person, Toth couldn't believe it. He leaned back in his chair feeling both relieved and also disturbed. He was relieved because he finally knew who John Parker's killer was, and he was disturbed because this case was now way more twisted than he had ever imagined. Based on the police investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to John Parker on the night of April 17, 2003. At around 10 p.m., the killer crept slowly through the shadowy parking lot at J&J Parker Industries. They were wearing a mask and dark clothes, and they were carrying a .25 caliber gun. They could see John's car by the office entrance, with Judy sitting inside of it. But she was not the killer's target. John was. And John was also near the car. He was not inside of it. He was standing right outside one of the back car doors. It was open, and he was rifling around, inside the car, looking for something. And as the killer stared at John, thinking about what they were going to do next, they thought about John, who this man was, and how controlling and selfish he was. He had made the killer's life a living hell. And now, the killer was going to get retribution. So, while John continued to have his back turned, the killer silently walked up right behind him. They raised their gun, aimed at the back of his head, and they fired. And it was a direct hit that hit him right behind the ear, and John fell so fast that when the killer fired a second time, they just missed. Now, the killer had never murdered anyone before, so they were shocked by what they had just done. But they were kind of jostled back into reality when they heard John's wife, Judy, yelling out and screaming. And so quick as can be, the killer grabbed John's wallet, so the police would think this was maybe a robbery gone wrong, and then they turned and sprinted off into the night. Much later that night, the killer waited at home until the person who had masterminded this whole thing arrived, and they gave them a hug and said they had done a good job. The mastermind then took the gun, John's wallet, and the clothes the killer wore during the murder, and told the killer they were disposing of them. And the killer just listened, feeling very relieved. He trusted the mastermind more than anybody else in the whole world, because, after all, she was his mother. It would turn out Judy had convinced her own 15-year-old son, Daniel, to murder his stepfather, her husband. Judy wanted to get out of her marriage with John, but she knew if she divorced him, she would have only gotten half of his estate and their business. And so with his death, she could get the whole thing. Now, she had actually already tried to kill John, just unsuccessfully. First, she had tried to poison him, but when that didn't work, she had hired a hitman herself. But that also failed. So finally, she asked Daniel to help by promising that he would get some of the money. And she had also enlisted her daughter, Christina, who was the one who found the gun to kill John with. Daniel actually tried to hire somebody else for the job, but then ultimately just did it himself and used his younger siblings for an alibi, saying he was at home babysitting. And the man who told all this to the police was Christina's husband, who she married 2 years after John's death. And once her husband gave authorities the whole story, police interrogated both Christina and Daniel, who eventually confessed. Judy was convicted of murder and sentenced to 33 years in prison, while Daniel got 23 years in prison. And Christina received 5 years for her part in the murder as well. Christina would die in 2013 from a drug overdose, Daniel was released in 2017, and Judy was released in 2022.
In the world is being a saturation diver for an oil and gas company. These highly specialized divers go down to extreme depths to do construction and demolition on underwater structures. The extreme pressure on their bodies from being so deep will cause some of the mixed gas they breathe to get trapped inside of their body. Now, this is harmless while it's happening, so while they're down at depth, this doesn't matter. But when they ascend, they have to do what's called decompression stops, where they basically stop in the water column at certain depths and just wait and allow these trapped gases to naturally come out of their body. Now, if they skip these decompression stops and just rush to the surface, those trapped gases will not leave their body and they will expand inside of them, causing a condition called decompression sickness, or the bends, and it can be fatal. Now, these decompression stops get longer and longer the deeper you go, and in the case of saturation divers, they'll go as deep as 2,000 feet. And for reference, in order to safely ascend from 2,000 feet, it would take you about 33 hours. And so these oil and gas companies can't afford to have their divers taking 33 hours in between dives, and so they came up with a clever workaround. They built a pressurized chamber system on board ships and oil rigs where their divers would live in between their dives. And what this did was, by keeping their divers constantly under pressure, either literally underwater or in this system, the trapped gases inside of them didn't have a chance to expand, and so their divers couldn't get the bends. The divers would live inside of this incredibly cramped chamber for weeks at a time, getting transported to and from the seafloor inside of this small pressurized sphere that's called a dive bell that could detach from the chamber without totally depressurizing the whole system. At the end of these divers' multi-week shifts, they would do one long decompression stop inside of the chamber. And then when they were done, they'd step out of the chamber and they'd be fine again. In September of 2012, a 32-year-old saturation diver named Chris Lemons was on board a dive ship in the middle of the North Sea. He, along with 11 other divers, had just started a 4-week-long saturation shift. On the 12th of that month, Chris, along with 2 other divers named Dave and Duncan, were scheduled to perform routine maintenance on an oil platform 330 feet below the surface. The North Sea is notorious for terrible weather, but this day the weather was especially bad, and they considered not doing the dive, but ultimately they decided to do it anyways. As Chris, Dave, and Duncan put on their diving equipment and climbed from their living chamber through the tunnel into the dive bell, the captain of the ship navigated directly over this oil platform and then flipped on autopilot mode, which activated dynamic positioning. Now, dive ships rely heavily on dynamic positioning, which is really just this high-tech computer that makes sure as soon as you turn it on that the ship does not move from a particular spot in the water. So regardless of the swells and the wind, the ship stays steady. And this is really important when you have divers in the water, because the dive bell is connected to the ship and the divers are connected to the dive bell. And so if the ship is moving all over the place, so is the dive bell, and so are the divers, making it impossible for the divers to do their job. Once the captain had the dynamic positioning up and running, the 3 divers sealed the door of the dive bell behind them, and then the dive bell was detached from the chamber and then lowered through a hole in the middle of the ship into the ocean. Once the bell got down to 330 feet, Chris opened up a hatch on the bottom of the dive bell that led directly into the water. Now, because the pressure inside the bell matches the pressure outside the bell, water does not come in through this hole. Duncan was the bellman for the night, so he would not be going out and doing any diving. He would be staying in the bell to support Dave and Chris. And so he helped them get their big helmets on and connected their umbilical to each of them. Sat divers, when they're outside of the bell, are completely reliant on their umbilical. It's this long stretch of tubes and wires that are connected directly to their suit and to their helmet, and it provides air as well as heat and electricity to their lights, and it provides radio communication up to the people on the boat. Once Chris and Dave were all set up, they slipped through the hole at the bottom of the bell, which brought them down to this little platform that was suspended right below the bell, and from there they leapt off all the way down to the sea floor. Now, sat divers will say that leap from that platform is both amazing and terrifying, because once you leave the bell, it's completely pitch black all around you, so there's no reference point of how fast you're going or even how close to the ground you are. And so it feels like you're just sinking into this endless abyss before you crash into the ground. Once Chris and Dave did hit the ground, they stood up and began walking, and they were directed by the radio in their helmet which direction they needed to go to reach this oil platform. The oil platform was 11 meters tall, and it looked like a sort of pyramid of these big steel pipes. They climbed up the side until they reached their respective working area, and then they settled in to do their job, which they expected to take about 6 hours. At first, everything was going to plan, but about an hour into the job, something went terribly wrong on the surface. The dynamic positioning computer failed. Now, the captain immediately saw it and just expected the backup computer to kick in and take over. But in a terrible turn of luck, the backup computer also failed. And so very quickly, this huge dive ship began drifting in the rough seas, dragging with it the dive bell and the divers 330 feet below. While the captain struggled to try to fix the system and get it back online and get the ship back on station, another crew member hopped on the radio and called down to Dave and Chris, who were outside of the dive bell, and told them to abandon the structure and get back in the bell ASAP. And Chris and Dave could tell from the urgency in this person's voice that this was no drill, this was serious. Chris and Dave were both positioned on the south side of the structure about halfway up, and their umbilicals were running straight up the structure and then northward because the ship was drifting northward. So neither Chris nor Dave could go around the structure. They needed to go straight up before being able to climb their umbilicals back up to the bell. And so both men began climbing, but they could feel the tension on their umbilical was getting tighter and tighter, and Dave managed to get all the way to the top, and he cleared the lip, and as soon as he was on top, he started getting pulled away from the structure. And he looked to see if Chris was also getting pulled, and all he saw was Chris's umbilical, impossibly stretched, still draped over the south side, and he could not see Chris. And that's when Dave, Duncan, and all the people on the surface heard Chris come over the radio frantically saying he was stuck on the underwater structure. His umbilical had gotten wrapped around one of the pylons. And so through the radio, Chris asked Duncan to give him more slack. But Duncan said, "There is no more slack. We are completely tight here. You have to get it free." And Chris would say, "I can't unfree it. It keeps getting tighter and tighter. I can't get it off the pylon." And so Dave jumped down onto the platform and tried to pull himself over to Chris, but his own umbilical was getting pulled towards the dive bell, and so he could not help Chris. And so Dave knew he couldn't do anything, so he turned and began crawling up his umbilical towards the dive bell, and as he's climbing, he hears behind him this extremely loud explosion. It sounded like a shotgun going off, and what it was Chris's umbilical snapping under the tension. As soon as the umbilical snapped, it sent Chris flying backwards off the structure, falling towards the ocean floor. Without his umbilical, he wouldn't have had light, he wouldn't have had a radio to talk to anybody up on the boat, he wouldn't have had heat, and the water was just barely above freezing, and so he would have been very cold very fast, and he would not have had an air supply. Although he would have had 2 backup canisters on his back that would automatically turn on. However, they only gave him 5 or maybe 6 minutes of air. And so when Chris hit the ocean floor, it would have been eerily quiet and completely pitch black. He stood up at some point and looked around him and didn't see anything, but knew he had to get back to the underwater structure. It was his only chance of anybody finding him again. And so he had to make the impossible decision of just choosing a direction and blindly walking, not having any idea what you're walking towards. Choose wrong and you might walk over a cliff. But at some point, Chris made up his mind and just began walking in a single direction, and miraculously, he walked into the underwater structure. He climbed up the side until he got to the top, which was a flat metal grate, and there he looked around and saw there was no dive bell, there was no sign of anything. It was just him. He was completely all alone. And he must have known at this point that he was running out of air. He probably had maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. And so he would have been acutely aware that even if they're looking for him, they're not going to find him in time. He's going to die. And at some point, breathing would have become extremely difficult until there was no more air, and then he would have passed out and keeled over. Back on the surface, the captain was desperately trying to use manual controls to pilot the ship back over where Chris was, but because of how rough the seas were, it was proving to be nearly impossible. As the captain struggled, other members of the crew launched a remote-controlled vehicle into the water to at least go down and try to find Chris. And so they decided they would just pilot straight to the underwater structure and begin looking around that area. And so for a few anxious minutes, the crew on board the ship watched the camera, which was the live feed coming from this underwater vehicle, as it went through totally dark water. And then at some point on the screen, the structure just appeared, and the vehicle, as it went up towards the top, it got a look at the very top of the structure. And on the screen, they saw Chris lying on his side, totally motionless. At this point, he had been without air for at least 20 minutes. In a last-ditch effort, the captain decided to completely power off the ship and its computer and just do a hard reset, something that you would never do, especially in rough seas, because if it doesn't come back on again, you are dead in the water. But when they turned it back on again, the ship came on and the computer system came back online, including the dynamic positioning computer. And so the captain immediately threw it on autopilot and the ship navigated right over where Chris's last position was. After Chris's umbilical had broken, Dave had managed to climb back up to the bell, and he was just standing underneath that platform right beneath it. And so when the ship got right back over Chris's position, Dave leapt off the platform, got to the seafloor, climbed up the structure, grabbed hold of Chris's body, and hauled him back up into the bell. Once Chris's body was inside the bell, Duncan, the bellman, removed Chris's helmet, and he saw that his face was blue and he was totally lifeless. But Duncan immediately just gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And after giving him 2 big breaths, Chris came back to life. He started gagging and coughing, and he's looking around wide-eyed, and Duncan and Dave are looking at him like, you gotta be kidding me, you're supposed to be dead. And after about 30 seconds, the color in Chris's face had totally come back, and he was looking at Duncan and Dave and asked them, what happened? And Duncan and Dave didn't have an answer for him. And so instead, all 3 men just started laughing and hugging. They could not believe it. Once Chris was brought back up to the ship, the dive medic looked at him and concluded that nothing was wrong with him. He was perfectly fine, despite the fact he had been without an air supply for over 30 minutes. And 3 weeks after the incident, Chris was back down saturation diving again. Today, scientists don't know how Chris survived. The leading theory is that it was just so cold, it slowed his heart and his brain down, and that somehow kept him alive. But the reality is, his survival is a total mystery. Here is what the crew saw when their remote-controlled vehicle found Chris lying on top of that platform.
A little after 3 p.m. on March 22nd, 1959, a 20-year-old British college student named Neil Moss stood in a cavern about 1,000 feet underground in northern England. And as he stood there, he was staring with excitement into this dark hole right in front of him. The cavern that Neil was standing inside of was known as Peak Cavern, and it was one of the biggest and most twisting cave systems in the entire country. In fact, it was so big that at one point, an entire village of 30 rope makers lived inside of this cave. And then also, after those rope makers, the cave system became a hideout for criminals and thieves because there were so many secret passageways and basically places to hide inside of the system. So basically, Peak Cavern was a pretty famous place. And as a result, basically all of it had been mapped out or at least explored by scientists and spelunkers, except for this hole right in front of Neil. It was an entrance to a tunnel that nobody even knew about. Neil and the amateur exploration group that he was a part of had discovered this entryway about 2 weeks earlier. Now, neither Neil nor anybody else in this group had actually gone into this hole yet, and the reason for that was it was pretty dangerous. I mean, the opening to this tunnel was pretty small. It was 1.5 feet by 2 feet wide at the opening. And just looking down into it, I mean, it's a dark hole that you really can't tell how tight or how far it even goes. And so once you went inside of it, the deeper you got, the higher the risk of entrapment. And so whoever actually went into this hole really needed to be prepared. But Neil and the rest of his amateur exploration group really felt like it would be worth it to try to go down this tunnel. Not just because nobody had done it before, but specifically, they thought there was a chance that beyond this tunnel, basically deep underground, if you followed it long enough, it could lead to another big open chamber that nobody had found before. And those types of big open chambers, whoever finds them gets it named after them. And so Neil and his group were thinking, hey, if we find this big chamber, it'll be named after us. We'll be famous, at least in, spelunking circles. But they also understood that there might be nothing at the other end of this tunnel. It could just be a dead end. But the only way to know for sure would be if one of the members of this group went into the hole. Now, in addition to a fear of being trapped in the hole, there were other big issues with blindly crawling into a tunnel no one's been in before. Like, for example, there could be a sudden drop-off, or running water, or some other hazard that whoever went into the hole wouldn't know about until they were facing it. And so naturally, everybody in this group was excited about the hole, but also a little apprehensive about being the guinea pig to actually go into the hole. And so after the group had kind of stood around the hole for a minute, kind of talking through who was going to do it, Neil had finally courageously volunteered to be the guinea pig.
he would go down. And in many ways, Neil was kind of like the perfect candidate for this job. He was smart, he was strong, and most importantly, he was thin, which meant he could navigate a really tight space. The only drawback to Neil was he was pretty tall. He was over 6 feet. And generally speaking, the best cavers in the world are very short and thin because it allows them to get into the smallest, tightest spaces underground. And so Neil, who was standing over the hole, began to mentally prepare himself for what he was about to do. He pulled out his flashlight and he shined it straight down into this hole, which again is a pretty narrow hole, and it basically went straight down. And as he was shining it, he saw about 12 feet down, the hole kind of turned and you couldn't see what was beyond it. And so Neil knew the only part of this trip he would know about is that first 12 feet. Once he made that turn, everything beyond that was totally unknown. Literally no one in the world knew what was beyond it. But Neil was about to find out. The cave explorers anchored this 75-foot-long wire ladder that was all rolled up to this rock that was inside the cavern, right near the opening to this hole. And once that was in place, they spooled out the ladder and kind of dumped it down into the hole. And so it fell 12 feet down and landed right where this tunnel turned and sort of went into oblivion, where nobody knows what happened after that. And so Neil, his job was going to be to go into this hole feet first, go down 12 feet, and then with his feet, as he kind of blindly crawled backwards feet first into the tunnel, he'd be kicking with his feet this ladder, extending it farther and farther into this tunnel. The idea was this ladder was his way back out again. So he's basically on top of the ladder, making his way, and at any point he can just grab the ladder and climb back out again. And so once the ladder was in place and all the cave explorers were kind of waiting for Neil walked up to the edge of the hole, he took a deep breath, and then he swung one leg into the hole, placed it on one of the rungs of the ladder, put his other leg on the ladder as well, and kind of tested it to make sure the rock that was anchoring the ladder could hold his weight. Once he was sure it could, he said goodbye to the explorers and then began his descent, feet first, down into the hole. As Neil slowly and carefully climbed down this ladder during this first 12-foot section, he felt the walls of this hole closing in on him. When he was close to the bottom of this first section, the walls were literally flush with his shoulders and back. This was a really tight space. And so finally he got to the very bottom of this 12-foot section, and he was about to step onto what he thought was another rung, because he can't actually see where he's going. He's just using his feet to feel. And he stepped down and he felt something hard. It was the ground. So he had reached the bottom of the 12-foot section. He kind of tested the ground with his foot, seeing if it would support his weight. And after feeling confident, he stepped off the ladder and just stood at the bottom of the hole. At this point, Neil used his feet to kick the ladder that was still coiled up at the bottom of the hole into the next turn, into the next section of the tunnel that he'd be going down. And as soon as he kicked it, he heard it kind of spool out as it tumbled down this next section. However, it was not a straight drop like this first section was. This next section he'd be going into was more of a gradual decline, just based on the sound this ladder was making as it tumbled down. And so after the ladder had stopped making noise and he knew it had stopped, Neil gave one final look up at his friends above, gave them a little wave, even though he could barely move his hands because it's so tight around him. And then he got down on his stomach and feet first began shimmying himself down into this next section. Now, during the first 12 feet and during the initial turn into this new section, Neil had been able to turn his head and basically look down and see where his feet were going. But after only a few feet of going into this new section, the walls had become so tight on his body that he couldn't even move his head. He really was blind and had no idea where he was going. Now, for a lot of people, this would have been a claustrophobic nightmare. Neil is in this unbelievably tight space. He has no idea what's gonna happen next. He doesn't know if it's gonna get so tight he'll get wedged in there. It's cold, it's damp. It's pitch black in there. He does have a headlamp, but his head is like kind of pressed to the ground and he can't really move it. So, he's not really able to look around him. And periodically, as he was shimmying his way down deeper into this tunnel, he would dislodge rocks from the wall and he would hear them strike the wall as they tumbled down into oblivion. He had no idea if these rocks were tumbling into a dead end or if they were tumbling off a ledge somewhere, a ledge that he wouldn't be aware of until he got to it. But for Neil, this environment was something he thrived in. It was why he was so drawn to cave exploration. As much as cave exploring was a physical exercise and a physical test, it was much more a mental test. Can you handle being in these tight spaces and persevering and continuing on when you're all by yourself and it's like dangers all around you? And also, Neil just loved being alone and in the dark. So cave exploration was like perfect for him. When Neil had made it about 10 feet down this new section, his feet touched the rolled up section of the ladder. And so with his toes, he kind of gave it a kick, and the ladder tumbled for a second and he could hear it. And then it just kind of vanished altogether, like the ladder had gone over a cliff. And so Neil realized, very likely, just beyond his feet, even though he cannot see it, is a ledge, and very likely either a drop-off or a new cavern. You know, the thing they hope is on the other end of this tunnel. And so this was exciting for Neil. He felt a rush of adrenaline. You know, there's a new turn in the tunnel, and for all he knows, this is the cavern they're looking for. Or it's just another section of tunnel he would have to explore. But either way, he's making progress. And so Neil very carefully scooched backwards until he felt the edge, at which point he let his legs go over the edge, he found his footing on the ladder, and it was at this point, when he kind of turned around a little bit, that he could see this was not some big open cavern he had found. It was just a turn in the tunnel system. It was now going back to basically a vertical hole, big enough to fit inside of, but Neil has no idea how deep it goes or what it leads to. But Neil was totally undeterred. He lowered his whole body into the section, got on the ladder, and began descending. And very quickly, as he began this descent, the walls of this section, this new vertical section, were so tight, it was about 18 inches in diameter, that he actually couldn't just go straight down. His body didn't fit just trying to maneuver down. So the only way he could get himself to go down further was to like shimmy himself side to side like a corkscrew, basically forcing his body deeper and deeper into this hole. And so Neil continued doing this for an additional 18 feet down in this new section of tunnel, which put him at a total of 40 feet down into this tunnel from the entrance where the rest of his friends were. And when he got down there, 18 feet down, he went to step onto the rung to continue his descent, but his foot hit rock. And he felt around with his feet, and he realized this tunnel did not lead to a big new chamber. It instead was a dead end after all. Now, just to be sure, Neil actually kicked as hard as he could. You know, he's kind of restricted, but he kicked with his legs as much as he could to see if maybe this wasn't a true dead end. Maybe it was just an obstruction and he could clear it. But he could tell, you know, after a few stomps, this was not moving. This really was the end. Now, part of Neil was disappointed because he was hoping that by doing this, they would discover this big new chamber and they'd get it named after them. But on the other hand, he was also relieved because by this point, it was extremely claustrophobic, even for a guy who thrived in this environment. You know, by the bottom of this 40-foot section, he is completely wedged in place. And so Neil decided it was time to head back to the surface. But from where he was at, he couldn't even hear his friends. He's way down deep in this tunnel. It's totally pitch black. And so what he needed to do was just begin climbing back up this ladder. And then, you know, about halfway up, he could call up to his friends and tell them, hey, you know, I'm returning. But remember, to get to where Neil is, he has literally forced his body down into this tiny hole, basically corkscrewing himself as deep as he could get. And so he's totally restricted, and his arms are basically by his side, and his hands are basically pinned in front of his body. And so Neil tried to grab the ladder, which is literally pressed up against his chest, to begin the ascent. But even though his fingers could touch the rungs of the ladder, he couldn't actually move his arms to pull himself up the ladder. He could just hold the rung. That was it. But Neil had been in similar situations before, and what you do is you just use your legs. You drive with your legs and push your body up until your arms can go above your head, and then you continue the ascent. However, his legs also were basically in the same situation. It was so unbelievably tight around his legs that he couldn't lift his legs up. He could just basically wiggle his feet. Basically, there was no way physically for Neil to get himself out. He would need his team up above to pull him out. And so Neil began shouting as loud as he could, trying to get the attention of his friends up above, you know, telling them, hey, I'm stuck, pull me out. And then also, as best as he could with his hands on the rung, he kind of pulled on the ladder, signaling to them like, hey, get me out of here. Now, he couldn't really hear anything up above. It was sort of muffled, and you know, he couldn't tell if they were yelling back down to him. But as he was holding onto the ladder, he felt a little bit of tension, suggesting they were pulling on him. However, as he held on, waiting to be pulled up and out, he didn't budge. Like, despite the tension on this ladder clearly coming from the surface from his friends, he wasn't moving. And that's when Neil realized he had made a critical mistake. When he had reached the bottom of this tunnel, when he realized it was a dead end, he had stomped with his feet to confirm it really was a dead end. And when he had done that, he had inadvertently kicked the rungs of this ladder into a crevice, and then rocks, which he had heard kind of falling when he was kicking, landed on top of it, basically pinning the ladder in place. Basically, this ladder was now anchored inside the cave, which meant no matter how hard his friends on the surface pulled, they would not be able to pull the ladder up, which meant they couldn't pull Neil up. And Neil, once he realized this was the issue, he tried to move his feet to clear the rocks off the bottom of the ladder, but he couldn't. It was too tight around him. And so Neil was totally stuck. Members of Neil's exploration group pretty much immediately realized this was a crisis, because not only was Neil stuck in this cave, but in these tight little tunnels underground, there's limited oxygen. So it's not just a matter of, oh, we'll figure it out and get Neil out somehow. It's like, no, you have a limited amount of time before Neil runs out of oxygen down there. Even if you come up with a solution, it might be too late. And so immediately, members of the exploration group left Peak Cavern to go get help. And before long, over 200 people had flooded the cavern, including a mountain rescue unit and a coal mining extraction team and a whole bunch of civilians who were all there to try to figure out how to get Neil out. Now, at first, Neil was very optimistic about his recovery. He could hear clearly all the commotion 40 feet above him. He couldn't fully discern what was going on there, but he could clearly tell a major rescue operation was afoot. And so as ropes were cast down and ladders were cast down to try to get him out, and they continued to fail, and as the air he was breathing began to thin out and it was getting harder to breathe, Neil's reaction was to kind of be positive. He actually began cracking jokes and calling up like, hey, how much longer do I have to wait down here? But as the minutes turned into hours and none of the efforts by any of the rescuers were working, Neil began to panic. His heart was racing, not only from his nerves, but also because he was running out of oxygen. He had begun to grit his teeth really hard to kind of control his fear, but he was really starting to lose it. At one point, the rescuers threw down an oxygen mask for him to breathe because it was clear the air was becoming a real issue. But even though the mask literally tumbled down and hit him right on the head, so it's right here, he couldn't get his arms up to put the mask on. And so there it is, salvation, but he couldn't use it. And so before long, Neil sort of began drifting in and out of consciousness. One moment he'd be calling up to his rescuers, asking for an update. The next, they'd call down to him and get no response. Clearly, this situation was becoming dire. Now, to this point, the way the rescue had gone was the rescuers were basically throwing equipment into the hole, be it ladders or ropes or oxygen masks for Neil to grab onto or put on him, and they were hoping that basically Neil could get himself out of the hole. Because the great fear was, if we send a rescuer, or rescuers plural, into this hole to get him, they could get stuck, and now we have an even bigger problem. But when Neil began losing consciousness, when they couldn't get him to call back to them, they knew they were genuinely running out of time. And so they began pumping oxygen into the hole to hopefully buy some extra time. And then they decided, we gotta send someone into the hole. Someone has to go in there, get Neil, and pull him out. And so one by one, these courageous rescuers went down into the hole, and 8 times they tried, and 8 times they failed. All 8 either got stuck along the way or they passed out along the way. 3 people actually reached Neil and actually touched Neil, but there was no way to grab him and pull him out. And so Neil, who was conscious for a lot of this, like he's hearing and literally in some cases seeing rescue. It's right there, it's right in front of him, but it just didn't work. By the time the 8th man was pulled back out of the hole, they could hear in the hole this horrible sound, which was Neil gasping for air. Even though they were attempting to pump air into this hole, it wasn't enough, and Neil just couldn't fill his lungs with enough oxygen. And so the rescuers yelled into the hole for Neil to just hold on. They were gonna get him out of there, just be strong, hold on. But by this point, Neil, he wasn't even saying anything back. He just continued making these awful gasping sounds. By about 7 p.m., when Neil had been stuck in this hole for 4 hours, the rescuers decided to send one more guy into this hole, this really small civilian. And he went down there with a rope to attach around Neil and hopefully pull him out. And this little civilian managed to get all the way down, all the way to Neil. And when he found Neil, Neil was unconscious, but alive. And the rescuer put the rope around Neil's shoulders and then signaled to the surface to begin pulling. And so from the surface, they pulled on this rope, and slowly but surely, Neil began to be pulled out of the hole. and he moved about 18 inches, being monitored by the civilian who was down there. However, because they were pulling so hard on this rope to get Neil to move, the pressure from that rope was basically crushing Neil's chest, and he stopped breathing. And the civilian who was down there with Neil noticed it and yelled up to the group to stop. And they had to take the rope off because, yeah, they might be able to pull him out this way, but they would kill him. He would suffocate. And so once the civilian rescuer came out of the hole, he told the group, like, look, Neil's body is simply too big to be yanked out of the hole safely. He needs to be conscious and able to contort and twist his body, basically undoing what Neil did to get down there in order to get out again. Like, we need his participation, and he's unconscious, so we can't do that. And so at this point, the rescuers were totally desperate. You know, they know Neil is still alive. They can hear some of his ragged breathing coming out of the hole, but they knew they had to do something drastic right now or Neil was gonna die. And so they came up with this plan for this even smaller rescuer, this woman, to go down into the hole, get to Neil, and break his collarbone to try to shrink his body to be able to pull him out. And so this woman, she goes down there and she reaches Neil, but she failed to break his collarbone. And so she too had to come out of the hole, leaving Neil behind. And so once the woman came out of the hole, it became clear to the rescuers that Neil was not getting out of this hole, even though he was just 40 feet away and at this moment still very much alive. They could hear his ragged breathing, but there was just nothing anybody could do. And so one of the rescuers called Neil's father and told him, you need to come out to Peak Cavern. Not long after that, Neil's father, Eric Moss, arrived at Peak Cavern. Now, he knew going into this that his son was stuck. That's why he got the phone call to come out here. But he did not understand just how dire the situation really was. But as soon as he got to Peak Cavern and saw all these vehicles outside and the hundreds of rescuers coming in and out of the cave with these sad, dark expressions on their faces, Eric knew this was really bad. And so Eric made his way into Peak Cavern, and for hours he just hoped and prayed that whatever was happening would be enough to get his son out. And for hours, Eric just stood there in Peak Cavern, hoping to see his son emerge from the hole, hoping to come up and say everything is okay, but he didn't. And things only got worse. It eventually began to rain, and unfortunately, Peak Cavern, and specifically the hole that Neil was stuck inside of, flood when it rains. And so as rainwater is pouring into this cavern and Neil is still alive but stuck in this hole, they had to make the heart-wrenching decision in front of Neil's father to abandon the operation and get out of the cave, knowing Neil was going to die. Rescuers were finally able to get back into Peak Cavern at about 3 a.m. on March 24th, which is approximately 36 hours after Neil got trapped. By this point, the rains had subsided, the flood had cleared, and so they went in there hoping for a miracle. And when they got to the hole and listened into it, they actually heard Neil still breathing. He was still alive, but it was very clear he was at the end of his life. And all they could do was just sit around this hole and listen as Neil took his last few final ragged breaths. And then eventually they listened as Neil took his final breath and the hole went silent. Now, at this point, it was too dangerous to send anybody back down into this hole, and so no one could get physically close enough to Neil to actually confirm that he really is dead. However, after the hole remained silent for quite a while, a doctor who was on site did walk over and declare Neil dead. And so at this point, the rescue operation became a recovery operation. However, as rescuers were getting ready to go back down into the hole to retrieve Neil's body, it was at this point that Neil's father, Eric Moss, who had been there this whole time and had been witness to the doctor declaring his son dead, it was at this point that he stepped in and said, "Stop, get everybody out of the cave. I don't want anybody else to lose their lives." And so ultimately, Eric made the decision to leave his son's body where it was. Eventually, once it was 100% certain that Neil really must be dead at this point, they would fill in the hole that Neil had climbed down inside of with loose rocks from the cave, entombing him inside of it forever. And in his memory, the tunnel that Neil died inside of was named after him. It's called Moss Chamber.
The Japanese declared war on China and invaded their country. The United States, who was friends with China, initially did not intervene in fear of provoking Japan, but after the Japanese murdered hundreds of thousands of unarmed Chinese civilians and the Japanese attacked an American warship, the United States was forced to step in. American officials responded to the Japanese aggression by placing serious economic sanctions and trade embargoes on Japan, believing this would cripple their war efforts in China, causing them to have to retreat. However, these sanctions and embargoes did not have this effect. Instead, they just angered Japan and made them even more determined to hold their ground in China. Over the next few years, the United States and Japan attempted to negotiate some sort of settlement, but neither side would make any concessions, and so neither side would budge. A few years later, on the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise aerial attack on the American military base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. After the 2-hour attack was done, over 2,400 Americans were killed, with another 1,000 wounded, and 300 airplanes and 20 ships were either destroyed or significantly crippled. The Japanese had hoped this attack would goad the United States into lifting the sanctions and embargoes they had placed on them from back in 1937, but instead, all the Japanese did was goad the United States into all-out war with them. One day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States officially declared war on Japan, thus entering World War II. On the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Jack Lucas, like every other American in the country, was glued to his radio listening to the news. He was devastated and shocked at this carnage he was hearing about in Hawaii, and so by the time the President of the United States was declaring war on Japan, Jack had already made up his mind that he was going to join up and he was going to fight for his country. However, there was an issue. Jack wasn't old enough to join the military. You needed to be 17 years old, and Jack was only 14. But this was not going to stop Jack. So he created this fake document that said he was 17 years old, and he forged his mother's signature on it. And then, after bribing him, he got a notary to sign off on this document as well. And so Jack took his forged documentation, he gave it to the recruiter, and before long, Jack was accepted into the armed services and was on his way to Marine Corps boot camp. After completing initial training and becoming a Marine, the Marines found out Jack's paperwork was actually faked. But instead of kicking him out of the military, they said, Jack, you can stay in, but under one condition. You can't go overseas to combat. You have to stay in the United States. You can drive a truck and help out around here, but you can't deploy and go to war until you're of age. Jack was not happy about this, but initially he did as he was told, and he did just drive a truck around and support it as best as he could. But after about 1.5 years, 2 years of this, Jack just couldn't do it anymore. That was not why he had forged this document to get into the military. He had done that so he could actually go fight in the war. And so finally, when he was just 16 years old, he abandoned his post and snuck onto the back car of a troop transport train that was going to another military base. And so when he arrived at this base, which was in California, he hopped off and then ran to the docks where there were these big warships. And he saw one of them, there was a whole bunch of troops loading onto it. And he figured, that's where I need to go. And so he snuck onto the ship and he hid down below. And then after the ship took off and was out to sea, he revealed himself and he walked up to a Marine officer and he kind of played off the, oh, I must have got on the wrong ship, but now that I'm here, can I join your unit? And this officer, who had no idea how young Jack was, eventually said, okay, but prepare yourself because we're going to invade Iwo Jima. Now, Jack had never heard of Iwo Jima and did not know its significance. But frankly, Jack didn't really care. He was just glad that he was actually going to see combat. What Jack couldn't have known, and what the other Marines on this ship couldn't have known either, is that the battle for Iwo Jima would become one of the bloodiest and deadliest battles of the entire war. The Japanese that were on this island defending it were absolutely fearless and would not surrender despite being outnumbered, and they were heavily entrenched in these caves and tunnels built in all over the island, and they rarely left these caves and tunnels, which meant Jack and the other Marines, when they landed on this island, the only way they could fight the Japanese was by literally crawling down into these tunnels, which were usually booby-trapped, and fighting up close and personal with the enemy. Jack's ship arrived off the coast of Iwo Jima in February of 1945, when Jack was still 16 years old. On February 19th, the first wave of Marines climbed down the side of this big ship down onto these smaller amphibious landing crafts, and then one by one they began making their way towards Iwo Jima to begin the invasion. Jack was not part of this initial invasion. He would be going out on day 2 with the second wave of Marines. And so Jack and all the other second wave Marines just stood at the front of the ship and watched as these amphibious crafts made it up to the beach and then just got completely gunned down by Japanese machine gunners that were lining the beach. And so by the second day, when Jack and the rest of the Marines are getting ready to launch their assault, there are literally thousands of dead Americans just lining the beach. But Jack and the other second wave Marines, they knew this was their job, this was their duty, and so they were undeterred. They climbed down the side of the ship, they boarded their amphibious landing craft, and began the journey towards the island. As they got closer, the Japanese machine gunners opened fire not only on Jack and the boat he was in, but all of the crews that were coming towards the beach. And so hundreds of Americans were just getting gunned down before they even reached the sand. Jack and his crew managed to get to the beach, and so as the gate dropped on their boat, and as Jack is running onto the beach, the men around him are just getting cut to pieces by these machine guns. Jack manages not to get shot, and he, along with 3 other Marines, run up the beach and they lay down in front of the sand dune that protected them from these machine gunners. Jack knew he couldn't stay there for very long because the Japanese were also firing artillery shells onto the beach, and so it would just be a matter of time before he was blown up. And so Jack and these other 3 Marines that had arrived at the same time, they began moving north, doing their best not to get shot or blown up, stopping behind rocks and trees and jumping behind sand dunes. And after a couple hours of doing this, the 4 of them reached the airfield at the northern end of the island. And when they get there, a machine gunner inside of a pillbox. A pillbox is like a small concrete fort that only has openings on 3 or 4 of its sides that are just big enough for a machine gun to poke through. A machine gunner inside one of these pillboxes notices Jack and the other 3 Marines, and they open fire on them. And somehow, Jack and these other 3 Marines managed to not get shot, and were able to maneuver and then fire through one of those openings and take out the machine gunner inside. And so now that this gunner is down, Jack and the others see the opportunity to run forward and take more ground of this airfield. And as they're running, other Japanese soldiers in the general vicinity, they see them, they start opening up on them from other pillboxes and other locations, and it forces Jack and these Marines to just jump into the nearest trench to avoid getting shot. And so they're jumping into a Japanese trench, which is a deep hole dug in the ground to protect yourself from getting shot. And as they jump in there, they're expecting to see Japanese soldiers coming towards them, but there weren't any soldiers. But they knew they couldn't stay there for very long because eventually Japanese soldiers would come through here and then they'd get killed. And so they quickly decided their best bet was to basically get out of this trench and run towards the pillbox where they knew they had taken out the machine gunner inside, so they could actually take that pillbox for themselves. And so their plan was they would run towards it and stop inside of each of the trenches along the way to protect themselves because they know there are other Japanese that know where they are. And then once they get to the pillbox, they can regroup and call in reinforcements. And so one of the men Jack was with said, okay, I'll go first. And so he climbs out of his trench as the Japanese are shooting at him, and he sprints about 10 or 15 feet until he gets to the next trench on the way to this pillbox. And so Jack is watching as this guy jumps into this trench, and as soon as he disappears out of view, this Marine is immediately turning around and scrambling to get back out of the trench, and he's trying to run back towards Jack and the other 2 Marines he was with. It would turn out this guy had jumped into another Japanese trench that was full of Japanese soldiers. He'd actually landed on top of an actual soldier. But these Japanese soldiers were so caught off guard by this, they didn't have time to react and shoot this Marine before the Marine was able to scramble out and get back to Jack and the others. And then for the next several minutes, Jack and these other 3 Marines opened fire on these Japanese soldiers in this trench like 10 or 15 feet away, and these Japanese soldiers, they too opened fire on Jack and the other 3. Jack was able to take out 2 of the Japanese soldiers before his gun jammed, and so he ducked down into the trench to work on his gun, and as he's down there, he notices there are 2 grenades on the ground right next to him. And so without any hesitation, he yells, "Grenade!" to the other Marines, and then he jumps on top of them, smothering the grenades with his body. One of the grenades was a dud, and so it didn't explode. The other was not a dud, and it went off. The way a grenade works is there is a small piece of explosive that is inside of metal housing that's usually spherical, and this metal housing is the thing you actually hold on to and throw when you throw a grenade. And so when this small explosive is triggered by pulling the pin and releasing the spoon, it detonates and it causes the metal housing itself to be ripped apart and sent flying. Basically, when a grenade goes off, it's like having hundreds of pieces of jagged metal shot off in every direction that are all traveling roughly at the speed of a bullet or faster. And so naturally, a grenade up close is incredibly lethal. In fact, the kill radius of a typical fragmentation grenade is about 5 meters. When the grenade under Jack that was not a dud exploded, it sent Jack flying into the air, and then when he came back down again, his comrades saw him and they could see he was clearly devastated from all the fragmentation that had been pumped into his body, and so they assumed he was dead. But even if they thought he was alive for some reason, there was nothing they could have done to have helped him, because they were actively being engaged by dozens of Japanese soldiers that were only about 10 or 15 feet away. And so eventually, these 3 other Marines that Jack had just saved were forced to leave Jack where he was and retreat back to the beach, and they would all live. The Japanese soldiers in the trench that they were fighting against would eventually come into Jack's trench, but most likely when they saw Jack laying there just completely ruined from this grenade, they assumed he was dead, and so they just kind of left him there. But Jack wasn't dead. He just couldn't speak, and he couldn't see anything, and he really couldn't move, although he could wiggle a few fingers on his left hand. And so for hours, as he lay there in agonizing pain, in and out of consciousness, he just wiggled the fingers on his left hand, hoping an American would see him and know he was still alive. And you gotta figure, this whole time, it is just constant chaos all around him. His chances of survival are incredibly slim. The idea that an American is gonna find him and be able to evacuate him is almost zero, and he must have known that. But by some miracle, eventually another American unit did find their way into Jack's trench, and they did notice him wiggling the fingers on his left hand. And so they were able to evacuate him from the trench down to the beach, and from there, under the cover of darkness, they were able to bring him out to a hospital boat offshore, and there he would begin the first of 26 major surgeries to remove the grenade shrapnel from his torso, his arm, and his face. Despite his grievous injuries, Jack would surprisingly make a full recovery. And 8 months after his injury, the President of the United States would award him the highest decoration for bravery, the Medal of Honor. He would be the youngest recipient of this award since the 1800s, and to this day, he is one of only a handful of miners to have won this award. Following his departure from the military, Jack would survive a near-death experience while skydiving when both of his parachutes, his main and his reserve, failed, and he just smashed into the ground, but somehow lived. He would also survive a very bad house fire, and he would survive an assassination attempt on his life by his ex-wife. And so naturally, he titled his memoir Indestructible. Jack would eventually die of natural causes on June 5th, 2008. 38-year-old Cindy Hack divorced her husband, Roy. As soon as she moved into another home in Vancouver, Canada, she felt this wave of relief come over her. Their marriage had become abusive and toxic years ago, but her newfound happiness would be short-lived. Only 4 months after leaving her husband, Cindy's waking nightmare would begin. It all started with a late-night phone call on October 7th, 1982. When she answered, the voice on the other side was raspy and angry sounding. It addressed Cindy by name and quickly told her that they planned on hurting her. And before Cindy could do anything, the caller had hung up. Cindy was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she did nothing. And then over the next few days, she received more calls from this phantom caller, and each of them began with this person addressing her by name and then threatening violence. And Cindy began to convince herself that this had to be some terrible prank, and so she continued to do nothing about it. One night, Cindy couldn't help but feel like she was being watched, and she looked into her living room and she noticed one of her windows was still open. At night, she would draw all the curtains in her house. And so she walked over to the window and she pressed her face up against the glass to look outside, and she didn't see anybody out there. And so she drew the curtains, turned around, and began walking back towards the kitchen when her phone rang. She hesitated, but eventually picked the phone up, and on the other side of the call was the mystery caller, who in a mocking tone told her that curtains weren't going to protect her, that they knew when she was home. This incident pushed her over the edge, and she knew this could not be some bad prank. This was real. And so she contacted the police, who made a house visit, but there wasn't any sign of a break-in or any sign of a crime being committed. And so after walking her property and feeling confident that she was safe, they told her that, you should really consider getting an unlisted telephone number. That way this mystery person can't keep contacting you. And so Cindy thanked them and would go on to get an unlisted telephone number. But not only would the calls continue, they would become more frequent. And in fact, the harassment in general only began to escalate. 3 days later, on October 15th, Cindy and her good friend Agnes were coming back from dinner to Cindy's house. And when they got there, they noticed that one of the front windows had been broken. And so they carefully walked onto the porch and realized the front door was actually unlocked and slightly ajar. They considered immediately leaving the property and just calling police, but they sat there for a minute and didn't hear anything inside the house, and so they decided they would just poke their head in and investigate. And so when they went inside, all the lights were off and there was no sign of a disturbance. It was totally quiet. But when they went upstairs, they found feathers all over the hall. And they followed those feathers all the way to Cindy's room. And in her room, all of her pillows had been ripped apart. And a key to her front door was laying conspicuously on her bedside table. The women fled the house and called police. But when they showed up, there really wasn't much they could do, despite knowing about Cindy's threatening phone calls she was getting. There was just no clear sign of who broke into her house and cut up her pillows. And so they told her that the best thing she can do is change her locks, make sure everything in her house stays locked at all times when she's home, and if she notices anything out of the ordinary, to call back. Over the following few days, Cindy got more threatening phone calls and began waking up to threatening notes laying on her front porch that had been made from newspaper and magazine clippings. This led to the police launching a larger investigation into the matter. An officer named Pat McBride, who had been on the force for 8 years, began checking in on Cindy almost daily. And very quickly, Pat and Cindy developed a romantic relationship, and Pat actually moved into Cindy's house while he was investigating this case. As soon as Pat moved in, the harassment seemed to stop. But just a couple of weeks later, in early November, Pat woke up one morning at Cindy's house and discovered that her phone lines were dead. When he went outside to investigate, he discovered that the lines had actually been cut, and he found a pair of wire cutters laying on the ground. Over the following month, in addition to the threatening phone calls and notes left on her porch, Cindy began hearing somebody walking around outside her house at night, but she was always too terrified to go to the window and look outside to see who it was. She began finding raw meat sitting outside of her door in the morning, and she would find pictures of dead bodies tucked under her windshield wiper on her car. One day, she walked into her backyard and she discovered 3 dead cats hanging in her garden. Cindy, who was a bubbly, happy person before the harassment started, had become a totally anxious and paranoid mess. But despite her obvious distress, the local police were starting to doubt her claims that this stalker was even real. Every time she called them claiming stalker activity, they would go to her house and look around, but they could never find any evidence to suggest that anyone besides her, her friends, or her boyfriend had been there. And speaking of her boyfriend, police officer Pat McBride, he would tell his coworkers that he was never home when the stalker called, and he never heard anybody walking around outside of her house. He said the only reason he knew about these things is because Cindy told him after the fact. Upset that the police were not taking her seriously, Cindy broke up with Pat and decided she needed to move and start over in another town. Just days before Cindy was supposed to relocate, her friend Agnes stopped by. When she went to the front door and knocked and there was no answer, she walked around to the back and she found her friend crouched down behind the stairs as if she was hiding from something. She ran over to her and noticed she had this black nylon stocking wrapped tightly around her neck, but Cindy seemed to be totally unfazed by it and just kept looking out towards her shed. And so Agnes runs over to Cindy and says, "Cindy, what are you doing? What's on your neck?" And Cindy turned to look at her and her eyes were super wide and she was panicked, and she told Agnes that just minutes ago she had been walking out to her shed to get something when a man leapt out of the shadows and wrapped this nylon around her neck and began choking her and threatened that if she turned around to look at him, he would attack her family. So Cindy and this man struggled for a minute until Agnes's car approached, which spooked the man and he ran off. Agnes was shocked and she grabbed her friend and picked her up. She pulled the nylon off of her neck and the two of them ran inside and locked all the doors and windows. And then at that point, Cindy called the police. But when the police showed up, the only evidence of this attack was Cindy's first-hand account and this nylon stocking. but the police believed the nylon stocking was Cindy's and she had staged the whole event and she had tied it around her neck herself. A few days later, in January of 1983, Cindy moved into a new home in a town called Richmond, which is a suburb of Vancouver, Canada, and as soon as she got there, she painted her car a new color and she actually changed her last name to James. For months, she didn't see or hear from her stalker. But in October of that year, she found another dead cat on her property with a note next to it that just said, "You're next." Fearing for her life, she called the Richmond police, who set up a surveillance operation on her property. But for months, despite dozens of officers watching her house at practically all hours, they never ever saw any stalker activity. But as soon as the officers left for any amount of time, when there was a gap in surveillance, Cindy would call the police and report stalker activity. In time, this town's police department also began to suspect that Cindy was fabricating the stalker story, and they told her as much. Now, blatantly knowing the police were not taking her seriously, Cindy hired a local private detective named Ozzy Caban to look into her case. Immediately, he installed floodlights all around her property, and he gave her a two-way radio to place inside of her house that constantly broadcast back to Ozzy. That way, if she was in trouble, he would know about it even if she couldn't get to the radio to actually tell him. He also installed a panic button inside of her house that would send an alarm to him as well as to the police. In January of 1984, after only being on the case for a couple of weeks, Ozzy heard some strange sounds coming across the two-way radio. It sounded like there was some sort of struggle happening in Cindy's house. And so he tried radioing her to ask what was going on, but he didn't get a response. And so he flew over to her house, he knocked on the door, but there was no answer. And so he kicked the door down and found Cindy lying in the hallway motionless with a note on top of her hand that was held in place by a paring knife that had been stabbed through the note and then through her hand. The note said, "You're dead, lady." Cindy also had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. And so initially, Ozzy believed Cindy was dead, but he managed to find a pulse. And so he brought her to the hospital, and when she regained consciousness, all she could recall was feeling someone inject her arm with a needle, and then after that, she had no memory of the attack. The police, believing Cindy had staged the attack, did not bother to take fingerprints at her home or on the knife or on the note. Ozzy, on the other hand, believed his client was telling the truth. He didn't believe Cindy was physically capable of injecting herself in the area where the needle had entered her body. The angle was nearly impossible to achieve on her own. Once she was released from the hospital, the police, despite believing she was lying, continued their surveillance operation of her property. But like always, nothing ever happened when any of the officers were on duty. The stalker activity only was reported after they had left. Life went on like this for over a year, and during that time, Cindy's mental health continued to decline rapidly. She lived in constant fear of this stalker, and she was deeply embarrassed that the police believed she was lying. On December 11th, 1985, Cindy was attacked again, but the details on this are incredibly scant. Someone found her lying in a ditch 6 miles away from her home. She was wearing a single work boot and a single glove. She was suffering from hypothermia, and she had cuts and bruises all over her body, and she had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. She had no memory of the attack. The police told her that they believed this was yet another staged event, and so they did not do any significant follow-up. After a few days in the hospital, she was sent home, but she was terrified to be alone. So she reached out to her friend Agnes and asked if she and her husband Tom would stay with her for a couple of days, and they agreed. The first night they were there, Cindy woke up in the middle of the night and heard strange sounds coming from the basement. She woke up Agnes and Tom, and they heard the sounds too, and so they went down to the first floor, they opened up the door to the basement, and they looked downstairs, and very clearly there was a fire raging in her basement. And so Cindy immediately ran to the phone to call 911, but they discovered the phone lines had been cut. And so Tom ran outside to try to find a neighbor to call 911 for them. And when he went outside, he found a man just standing there in front of the house watching it. And Tom yelled to him, "Hey, you need to call 911. This house is on fire." And this man, without saying a word, just turned and ran down the street. And that man was never identified. Finally, Tom did get a neighbor to call 911. The fire department arrived and they put out the fire. And then after an investigation, they determined that the fire had been set intentionally. This was an act of arson. And the police said there was no signs of forced entry anywhere around the house, which means someone who was already in the house had to have started the fire. And they specifically said Cindy had to have started the fire because she stages these events all the time because of this stalker delusion she has. Agnes and Tom denied this claim, saying they never heard Cindy walking around at night and she would never jeopardize their lives. After this event, Cindy became extremely depressed and had to be hospitalized. And for 10 weeks, she was under intense psychiatric care. But at the end of those 10 weeks, the doctors determined that she was not a threat to herself or to anyone else, and so she was sent home. It was at this time that Cindy went to the police and said that she thinks Roy, her ex-husband, was behind all of the attacks. Police immediately brought Roy in for questioning, and he emphatically denied all allegations, saying he had nothing to do with it, and in fact, he had been the victim of this stalker that was going after his ex-wife. He said he got a number of these threatening phone calls, and one time when they called, they left him a voicemail, and he played it for the police. After speaking with Roy and confirming his various alibis, the police ruled him out as a suspect. For the next 3.5 years, Cindy continued to receive threatening phone calls and messages at her house, but no one besides Cindy ever saw this stuff happen live. While her private investigator, Ozzy, still believed every bit of her story, the Richmond Police Department had grown tired of her and stopped responding to her calls. On the evening of May 25th, 1989, Agnes showed up at Cindy's house for their scheduled game of bridge. When she knocked on the door, there was no answer. And because Agnes and Cindy were very close, Agnes tried the front door, it was unlocked, and so she let herself in, thinking Cindy must be upstairs taking a shower. But when she stepped inside, the house was totally silent. And after a couple of minutes of no commotion upstairs, Agnes began searching the house for her friend, and she discovered that Cindy wasn't there, and so she called the police. The police launched a search and very quickly found Cindy's car in a parking lot at a local supermarket. And when investigators went over the car, they discovered there was blood on the outside of the driver's side door. The contents of Cindy's purse, including her credit cards and ID, were scattered about on the ground near the car. And then in the trunk of the vehicle were the groceries that Cindy had recently purchased. But despite her car being found, there was really no indication of where she went next. Her friends and family believed she had been kidnapped by her stalker, and the police believed she was staging yet another event. But regardless, no one could find her. 2 weeks after her disappearance and 1.5 miles away from where her car had been found, a road worker had drank too much coffee and needed to use the bathroom. But where they were working, they did not have a portage on, and they were not near any local businesses that might offer public restrooms. The only area that offered any privacy was the abandoned building that was right near their work site. And so this worker told his crew where he was headed. He turned and began walking across the totally overgrown front yard of this property. And as he began walking around the side of this building, he smelled this horrific smell, like one of the worst smells he'd ever smelled in his life. And he assumed that because this property was abandoned, maybe people were dumping their trash on it somewhere and it's a hot day and that's why it smells. But either way, he wrote it off. He walked around to the back of this building. He found a good spot. He relieved himself. He turned around and began walking back along the side to go back to the road when he stopped, because he saw something lying near the side of the house that he was surprised he hadn't noticed on his way in. He couldn't really see what it was because the tall grass was obscuring his view, and so he took a couple steps forward to get a better look, and when he could see clearly what it was, he stopped. Because laying in front of him was a clearly deceased woman laying on her side with her hands and feet bound behind her back, and around her neck was a black nylon stocking. It was the body of Cindy James. Despite the nylon around her neck, the autopsy revealed she did not die from strangulation. She died from an overdose of morphine and other drugs. The police brought in a not expert who was easily able to put himself in the same position that Cindy was in and tie himself up. With this information, combined with their belief that Cindy was a pathological liar, they concluded that this had to have been self-inflicted, that she injected herself with the lethal dose and then dropped down to the ground and tied herself up to stage the epic conclusion to this stalker delusion. To cover their bases, the police did re-interview Roy, the ex-husband, but his alibi checked out and realistically, he was never actually a suspect. It's not listed online whether Pat McBride, the police officer ex-boyfriend, was ever investigated. While the police were very confident in their theory of what happened to Cindy, there were some discrepancies. The medical examiner did not agree with the ruling that this was a suicide. He said that you can't conclude that. There's not enough evidence. During the autopsy, it was discovered that Cindy did have an injection mark in her arm, but they could never find the needle anywhere near her body or anywhere between her and her parked car. Considering the extremely high dosage of narcotic that was found in Cindy's system, if this had been a suicide, as soon as she injected herself, she would have had to immediately shift gears, get down on the ground, and start hog-tying herself before she became too intoxicated to function, meaning the needle should have been right around where she was found. But it wasn't. Also missing from the crime scene were Cindy's shoes and socks, And interestingly, her bare feet were totally clean, despite the fact that in order to get where she was found, she would have had to cover a distance of at least 1.5 miles from her parked car. But again, there was no dirt or any markings on the underside of her feet. Also, it was strange that she wasn't discovered faster than 2 weeks. Although she was found near this abandoned house that was totally overgrown, the house was actually frequented by teenagers, and there was a walking trail nearby that would have had a line of sight on her body. These discrepancies have led many people to believe that Cindy did have a stalker, and this stalker kidnapped her in the supermarket parking lot. They tied her up, they injected her with the lethal dose of morphine, and then after she had died, they dumped her near this abandoned property right before she was found. And they had left that black nylon tied around her neck because that was the stalker's signature. Some have taken this a step further and said Pat McBride, the police officer, was behind the attacks, because he would have known when surveillance was set up on her house and could have very easily avoided detection. But the most bizarre and fascinating theory of what happened to Cindy is that she had dissociative identity disorder, or DID. This is where someone maintains at least 2 distinct personalities, and when one of those personalities is active, the other kind of fades and has no memory of this experience, creating these huge memory gaps. And so the theory goes, one of Cindy's personalities was effectively stalking herself. Or more specifically, one of her personalities hated herself and wanted to do herself harm. And so that personality would do things like stab her own hand or run 6 miles away into some ditch and leave herself for dead. And then Cindy's other personality would take back over, and she would suddenly come to having no memory of how she became injured or how she wound up in this ditch. And so when she went to police to tell them that someone is stalking, is harassing, is attacking me, she was telling the truth. But that someone, that stalker, was actually her. She just didn't know it. But Roy, her ex-husband, was a psychiatrist, and in their 16 years of marriage, he never noticed this condition. And when Cindy was in that psychiatric ward for 10 weeks following one of her stalker attacks, none of the doctors or psychiatrists ever noticed or diagnosed her with this condition. It's still possible she had DID, and it just came on later in life, and it didn't present itself enough to be noticed during those 10 weeks of psychiatric care. But realistically, this reduces the chances of DID being behind this whole thing. To date, her death is still considered a suicide, and no one has ever been charged in connection with her death.
James and Brittany Campbell jetted off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic and outgoing and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet and kind of analytical and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously back in high school, and it had not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again. But nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother. And so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the US Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest 2-story home located just a couple of minutes drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighborhood that really didn't look like the type of neighborhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs with all these cookie-cutter 2-story houses right up next to each other on either sides of the road, and out front everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighborhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019, so not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii. Brittany, she had to go into the garage to get something. Now, their garage was attached on the left side of their house if you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks. And so all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground. But even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. It looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike. Or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage, she goes to the other side of the house and she gets her husband, she brings James back and he looks inside, he's just as shocked as she is, and the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so the only other thing they could think of would be that their two young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over, and so this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the two young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it, and if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone one morning getting ready. She was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror and she was applying eyeliner and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials. And as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner. She's so startled by the sound of it. And she immediately pauses her YouTube video and she calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and somebody slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now, immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door, they got something or put something in the house, they slammed it and they left. And so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really she hadn't. And so she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. And then from the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door. That was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway, to the left was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had slammed. And so Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway. She doesn't see anyone. And so she yells out again for James and for her sons, but again, there's silence. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the second floor hallway and she makes it halfway. She turns left and she gets onto the stairs. And as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet and she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her and she's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. And she gets to the foot of the stairs. She kind of scans around her. She doesn't see anyone. And then she walks to the front door. She flings it open, expecting, hoping to see James
James's car in the driveway or just see some indication that her husband or her sons had been there or were there. But when she opened that door, James's car was not there. There was no sign of anybody in the area. It was just her. And so with her heart racing, she shut the door, she locked it, and then she walked all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything was locked. She went upstairs, she did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her. She was sure of it. And so she went back to her room thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? And so Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day. And then that evening, she would come back home and her husband and her sons would be there. And at some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of, could that have been him? And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door and a draft came through and slammed the door. You got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door. So the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, you're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it. But this really upset Brittany and she got mad at James. And before long, the two were just totally fighting about it. And by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, they weren't even speaking. And so the couple that night, they fall asleep angrily. And then in the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert. And instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens really intently to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there listening, she can hear again another door downstairs, a different door, opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs. Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being open and shut, he was just really upset. And so he sits up, he's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying. And Brittany's picking up on this. And so finally, she just says, James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed? And so James is like, yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house. But Brittany was not convinced. And she says, you know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house. And so Brittany would get out of her bed. She'd walk over to the open door that led into the second floor hallway. And as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything. She didn't hear anything. And so very slowly, she began walking down the second floor hallway until she reached the top of the stairs. And at that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so down the stairs she went, and when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked? And so then Brittany's thinking, okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here somewhere and they're the ones causing all this noise. And so Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them were fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in and she tells them, everything's fine. But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband and she tells James, the front door was unlocked and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, you are totally overreacting, you're being paranoid, you're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There isn't any doors slamming in the house. And as he's saying this, their back sliding door downstairs that led to their backyard suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally skeptical, he instantly changed. And he looked at his wife and he said, "You stay right here." And he jumped out of his bed and he ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom and he would tell his wife that, yeah, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that is opening and shutting doors, probably opened and shut the back door too. So we got nothing to worry about. The house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep. And at this, Brittany is incredulous. And she says to her husband, "You gotta be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We had that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening." And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. They were just fighting with each other. And then eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up and they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut, and then also, what happened in the garage, what caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements. Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James without Brittany around, and that would be the first time that he would get really spooked.
Started having severe chest pains. And at first, he tried to ignore it, but it got so bad he could barely stand up, and then he began coughing up blood, and so finally he went to the emergency room. When he got there, even before the doctors examined him or gave him an x-ray, just based on the way he presented to them, being pale in the face and hunched over and very sick looking, they assumed this must be something very serious. So that day, they brought Mr. Sidorkin in for an examination, and after talking to him and hearing about all of his symptoms and just looking at him, the assumption was he probably has a tumor in his lungs. And so they sent him in for an x-ray, and afterwards the radiologist looked at the x-ray and confirmed that, yep, there is a mass growing inside of your lungs. And so before they went to just start removing huge pieces of his lung, they told him that they would like to do a biopsy where they remove a small piece of the tissue and test it to see if it's cancerous or not. And so Mr. Sidorkin is terrified, but he says okay, he schedules his surgery, he goes in a couple days later, and the surgeon pulls out a piece of his lung tissue, and as it's sitting on the tray, he looks down at the tissue, the surgeon does, and he realizes there's something hidden inside of the tissue, as if the tissue was like an envelope holding something inside of it. And so he opened it up, and there, growing on the side of his lung, was a small fir tree. It was 5 centimeters long, it was green, it looked very lively, it was just a thriving little tree. The doctors believed Mr. Sidorkin, who was a botanist, had inhaled a seed of a fir tree, and it got lodged inside of his lung tissue. And then as it grew, its pine needles began piercing his blood capillaries, causing him to cough up blood. After the discovery of what was inside of his lung, a spokeswoman for the Royal Botanic Gardens in London said that it is possible for a seed to germinate inside of the dark, damp conditions inside of a lung, but it is unbelievably bizarre. When doctors informed Mr. Sidorkin that he did not have cancer, he had a tree, Mr. Sidorkin was shocked, and he said, "I never got the sense that there was a tree growing inside of me." But more than shocked, he was just relieved that he was cancer-free. There is a picture of this tree inside of his lung tissue, but it's a bit graphic, so if you want to see it, go ahead and Google tree in lung, and I'm sure you'll find it. 86, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife. They talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house, and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash bin. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, "What are you doing here?" And immediately the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house, and he looked in their driveway, and he saw that Kristen wasn't home, and it looked like nobody was home, and so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But
by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation. The idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight. And so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the two of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And so Doug led the way inside of his house, and as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face, and before long, the two of them were struggling on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion, and she came running down the stairs, and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground, while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down, Wayne throws her some cord, she ties up her husband's arms and legs, and then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement where he tied him up to a pole, and then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in, and then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints and she was reaching for the landline, and so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again. And then after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead, and Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so he took the rifle and he loaded it with the one round he found on the table. And then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor, he didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs. And so he made his way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom, and he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell, he took aim about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug. And finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol, and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other 2 miss. He doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle. And Doug sees that, he grabs the pistol and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. So that's going to do it, guys. In early June of 2011, in the Russian city of Kazan, a 49-year-old Russian woman named Fagiliu Mukametsonov woke up feeling nauseous. Fagiliu had recently had some health problems, and her doctors had told her that she really needed to take it easy, don't do anything that really stressed her out or made her mad, basically just relax.
And so, on that morning, this is exactly what Fagiliu decided to do. Instead of pushing through her nausea to go to work anyways that day, she decided she would call out from work and stay home and have some tea and try to just feel better. But a little while later, when Fagiliu was in the kitchen making tea, her husband, Fagili, he came in and asked her how she was doing, and she said, you know what, I actually feel worse. My nausea has gotten worse, my chest hurts, and I'm starting to sweat. I'm gonna go lie down in the bedroom. But as Fagiliu walked across the kitchen to go lay down, her chest suddenly tightened tenfold and she collapsed to the ground unconscious. Fagili rushed over to her and tried to wake her up, and when he couldn't, he rushed to the phone and dialed 112, which is Russia's emergency line, and he called for an ambulance. And then when the ambulance arrived, Fagiliu was not breathing, and by the time they got her to the hospital, she was declared dead. She had died from a heart attack. Fagili, who had been married to Fagiliu, his wife, for almost 30 years, was absolutely heartbroken, but he and his wife's religion encouraged people to have funerals within 24 hours of a loved one passing away. And so despite the fact that Fagili was basically despondent from all his grief, he pretty much immediately began calling relatives and friends and making preparations for Fagiliu's funeral, which would take place the next day. The next morning, Fagili woke up and put on his best suit, and then he joined his and his wife's family and friends at the funeral home for Fagiliu's funeral. When Fagili walked inside of the funeral home, he saw there were all these wooden chairs facing forward towards the front of the room, and at the front of the room, up on a table, was his wife's coffin, which was open and surrounded by all the flowers that Fagili had barely been able to buy with the little bit of money that he and his wife had. Fagili slowly made his way down the middle of the room to his wife's coffin, and the other people that were there saw him coming and got out of the way in respect to, the husband of the deceased. And so Fagili, he walks up and he looks down at his wife, who again, it's open casket so we can see her, and he was struck by her appearance. She just did not look right. Now, Fagili did not have enough money to embalm his wife, which means to preserve a dead body and make it look like it's very lifelike. And so instead, the people who worked in this funeral home had just applied heavy makeup to Fagiliu's face to try to make her appear more lifelike, but it really hadn't worked. To Fagili, it didn't even look like his wife. After all, Fagiliu never even wore makeup, and so to see her with heavy eyeliner and bright red lipstick was just totally bizarre. Behind Fagili was Fagili's family and Fagiliu's relatives, all assembled in the first row, and they were beginning their prayers for the dead. And so Fagili, he took a few more looks at his wife, and then he stepped back and joined the first row. And so as Fagili was standing there holding his mother's and brother's hand, he closed his eyes and did his best to focus on the words of the prayer instead of on the grief he was feeling for his wife. And as he was doing that, his mother, who was on his right side, suddenly broke from the words of the prayer and let out this strange crying sound. And Fagili, he opened his eyes and looked over at his mother, expecting her to be collapsed on the ground from all the grief she was experiencing. But instead, he saw his mother was trembling and looking straight ahead. And so Fagili followed her gaze, and what he saw at the front of the room made Fagili want to faint. His wife, Fagiliu, was now sitting straight up in her coffin. She wasn't making a sound, but she was looking out at the crowd of people with her strange makeup on her face, just staring at them with wide eyes. And for a second, everybody in the funeral home noticed this and went totally quiet, and both Fagiliu and the mourners just stared at each other. And then Fagiliu began screaming, but at first it was like she couldn't make any sound, and it was this raspy, dry yell that was coming out of her mouth. But then it built and built until it was sort of like a bellow or a roar. And when this loud, deep, guttural sound began coming out of Fagiliu's mouth, the mourners in the room began screaming too. And suddenly it was absolute chaos inside of this building. As funeral workers rushed to call emergency services, not knowing what else to do, Fagili, who also had been screaming after seeing his wife arise from the dead, he kind of snapped out of it and ran to his wife, and he embraced her, and when he did, Fagiliu went from screaming to silent, and she looked up at her husband with wide, scared eyes and began crying, and then she slumped forward into Fagili's arms.
At this point, Fagili's family and Fagiliu's family saw what was happening, and they kind of snapped out of it too, and they rushed forward, and they helped Fagili lift Fagiliu out of her coffin, and they laid her down on the ground. And even though she wasn't moving, her eyes were open, and she was looking up at her family, just absolutely terrified, with all her makeup running from her tears. And then 12 minutes later, when Fagiliu finally was rushed to the hospital, she was declared dead again. It would turn out that when Fagiliu collapsed on her kitchen floor, she really did have a heart attack, but it didn't kill her. She was just unconscious, and her breathing was very shallow, and she wasn't moving, and nobody noticed. And so when Fagiliu kind of came to and woke up inside of her coffin at her funeral, she likely was okay, all things considered. She was, healthy enough to be alive, but when she looked around the room and saw she was at her own funeral and sitting in her coffin, the stress of that moment had given her another heart attack, and this one had been fatal.